Hello, and welcome to Discerning Answers. Our seed reading this time is Matthew 19:26. But Jesus looked at them and said, "With man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible." So let's start with the possible part of this verse. Something positive. And let's create an equation that can help illustrate what this part of the verse is actually saying. It's a pretty simple and straightforward equation. It simply says God equals possible. And when you look at this equation, you begin to realize how amazing this promise is that Jesus has revealed to us. Everything is possible in God. God equals possible. However, it's also one that we as Christians have probably never ever fully come to grips with everything that this promise implies. Because the trouble is that even though all things are possible with God, and we've probably read this many times, and yet we always seem to want to place ourselves between God and what's possible. And let's change our equation to reflect that. So it now looks like God equals ourselves plus possible. So we've placed ourselves effectively between God and what is possible. Now, there are many ways that we can refer to ourselves, and one of those is I am.
Hello there.
Such as if someone asks the question, well, who's going to the marathon this weekend? You might say,
I am.
and like so many do today when texting, for example, words can be represented as letters. For example, you can convert CU into the letters C and U. So I am can also be expressed by just two letters, the letter I and the letter M, because when you say I am, it sounds a bit like I am. So if instead of using the word ourselves in the equation, we can replace it with that reference for ourselves, or in other words, the letters I am. So now the equation looks like this.
See you later, folks. Been nice seeing you.
God equals I am plus possible. Or if we do the addition on the right side of the equation now looks like this. God equals impossible. So when we place ourselves between God and what's possible, we end up making the possible impossible. And there's a great example of this in Matthew 14:29 and 30. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Peter allowed the world, the circumstances around him, to stir up his fears, which made him place himself in front of what was possible for Jesus to do. And when he did, he began to sink, because he had effectively made the possible impossible, because he'd placed himself between God and what's possible for God. Now, it's difficult for us to say anything against Peter, because I'm sure there have been times in our own lives when we have faced things that have seemed insurmountable, impossible. We may have tried trusting God through these times, but I wonder how many of us have only gotten a short way and then have taken our eyes off of God because we've suddenly seen the wind and the waves around us. We've seen the enormity of the task before us, or perhaps what the repercussions could actually be if we fail. In other words, we've placed ourselves in
Hey, back
between
again.
God and what is possible for Him. We've become afraid, or we've tried taking things into our own hands, both of which have caused us to begin to sink. All of those things around us, rushing in on us and overwhelming us. Thankfully, though, God doesn't get personally insulted by our doubts and just leave us to our own ends, but rather He's there, ready and willing to reach out and save us, just like Jesus did with Peter. And God's able to save us because in Exodus 3:14, it says, "Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you." God calls Himself I am. And so, just like with us, we're able to write God's name as those two letters, I and am. So now, if we put the name of God, I am, on top of that I am that refers to us, then effectively the two cancel each other out. So we're then left with an equation that looks like this. God equals possible. We're back to the beginning again, where everything is possible for God because we've taken ourselves out of the equation. So who is it that makes the possible into the impossible? I am, by placing my own fears and uncertainties and doubts between God and His promise that all things are possible with Him. So if you're facing something seemingly impossible in your life, then remember the promise of Matthew 19:26. And instead of concentrating on the enormity of the task or of what the circumstances might look like around you, reach out your hand to God, accept His help, and let the great I am cancel out your own fear and anxiety so that you can claim the promise of God to make your impossible possible. See you next time.